They picked the spot because it was behind the lines. That was the only mistake they made, and it was the last one they were allowed to make. On the morning of December 19th, 1944, the 326th Airborne Medical Company set up its tents at a crossroads in the Bois de Herbeimont, a few miles west of a Belgian town almost nobody in America had heard of yet, a town called Bastogne. They unpacked in frozen ground. They lit their lanterns. By 11 that morning, they were already cutting shell fragments out of men. They spread red crosses across every tent roof. At 10:30 that night, armored vehicles came out of the darkness from the northeast, and the machine guns opened up, and they did not stop for 15 minutes. Here is the part that has never stopped being unbearable. The trucks caught fire. The flames lit the canvas. The red crosses were plainly, unmistakably visible, and the guns kept firing anyway. Only one man died at that crossroads. One. Hold on to that number, because you are going to think it means this story is small. It means the opposite, and when you find out why, you are going to wish that one man was the worst of it. Make yourself comfortable with your favorite drink. Then check the time and tell us exactly what your clock says right now. We'd love to know what time people around the world are joining us. The trucks left Camp Mormelin in France on the night of December 18th, 1944, and the men riding in them did not know where they were going. That was not unusual. Soldiers rarely know, but this was different in a way that sat wrong in the stomach, because the 326th Airborne Medical Company had been in France resting. They had come out of Holland chewed up and thinned out, and they had been promised time, hot food, dry socks, a chance to stop hearing artillery in their sleep. Some of them had passes in their pockets they never got to use. Then the orders came down at a speed that told everyone something had gone very wrong somewhere to the northeast, and the trucks were loaded in the dark, and the convoy pulled out into a Belgian winter that was already killing men who had nothing wrong with them except that they were outside. They drove all night, open trucks, no headlights, because headlights draw aircraft. The cold in an open truck at speed does something to a man that ordinary cold does not. It gets underneath, it finds the place where your spine meets your skull, and it sits there. Men wrapped themselves in blankets and pressed against each other and did not talk, because talking meant opening your mouth, and opening your mouth meant letting the cold in. The road was ice over cobblestone. Every few miles the convoy stopped for no reason anyone could see, and then started again, and nobody explained anything. Coming the other way, on the same roads, going the opposite direction, were Americans. That was the part the medics remembered afterward. Trucks and jeeps and men on foot, headed south, headed away, headed anywhere. That was not where the 326th was headed. Some of them had no weapons. Some of them had no boots. They looked at the medical convoy going north with an expression that nobody in the trucks wanted to interpret. Somewhere out there in the dark, an entire American front had come apart. There is a thing that happens to a man riding toward a sound. For the first hour, it is nothing, a pressure behind the hearing, rather than a noise. Then it separates into individual events. Then, at some point, nobody can mark exactly. It stops being weather and starts being artillery. And every man in the truck knows it at the same moment, and none of them says so. The sky ahead of them was doing something it should not do at 4 in the morning. It kept lightning at the edges, low down, in flickers that had no thunder attached to them yet, and then the thunder would arrive late and out of order, the way it does when the distance is real. They arrived near Bastogne at 10 in the morning on December 19th. The town itself was nothing much. A market town in the Ardennes, gray stone and slate roofs. A place where 7 roads happened to meet. That was the only thing about it that mattered. And it was the reason everything that followed happened. 7 roads in a country of forest and gorge and river, where armies move on pavement or they do not move at all. 7 roads meant everything. Lieutenant Colonel David Gold was the division surgeon of the 101st Airborne, and the decision of where to put the clearing station belonged to him. Understand what a division clearing station is, because the whole story turns on it. It is not a hospital in the way a civilian thinks of a hospital. There is no building. There are tents. Inside the tents there are surgical teams and plasma and instruments and the men who know how to use them, and the entire purpose of the arrangement is to be the place where a wounded soldier stops being a casualty and starts being a patient. It is the hinge forward of it. A hurt man is carried on a litter by his friends and given morphine and a prayer. Behind it, A is on a table, under a light with a surgeon's hands inside him. The clearing station is where the difference between those two conditions is manufactured. The 101st had exactly one. Gold looked at his map and chose a crossroads in the Bois d'Ardennes, several miles west of Bastogne, and there was nothing wrong with the choice. It was sound, it was correct, it was by every rule of military doctrine that anyone had ever written down, the right answer. Because it was behind the town, the fighting, everyone understood, was to the east. The Germans were coming from the east. Therefore, the ground west of Bastogne was rear area. And rear area is where you put your wounded, because your wounded cannot run. Every officer in Europe would have made the same call. Gold made it, and it was the correct call, and it was fatal. And both of those things are true at once, and neither cancels the other. That is what happens to men in a collapse. The map they are reading is a map of a battle that has already stopped existing. They went to work fast, tent poles driven into ground so hard it rang, canvas hauled up in a wind that tried to take it away from them, lanterns lit, stoves going, surgical instruments laid out in rows on tables that had been packed in a truck 4 hours earlier. Watch a medical company set up sometime, and you will understand why these men were proud in a way that infantry never quite forgave them for. There is no glory in it, and they were very good at it. Sledges on tent stakes, men breathing white, hauling on guy lines with hands that had already stopped working properly. The ground at Herby-Mont was frozen to the depth of a shovel blade, and it fought them for every peg. And still, from an empty field to a functioning surgical hospital, took them under an hour, because they had done it in Normandy and they had done it in Holland, and their hands knew the sequence, even when their minds were somewhere far behind. Still asleep in a truck in France, by 11 that morning they were receiving patients. They came in a stream that did not stop. Liter after liter after liter, hauled off jeeps and trucks and the hoods of vehicles, boys from the regiments fighting to the east and north. And what was on those litters told the story of the battle better than any report reaching any headquarters that day. Shell fragments in chests, compound fractures where the bone had come through the skin and the skin had then frozen, gunshot wounds packed with mud, and the cold injuries, which were their own particular horror, feet that had gone past pain into a gray, waxy silence. So that when the medics cut the boots away, sometimes what came off inside the boot was not just the boot. Captain Jacob Pearl worked through it. So did the rest of them. The tents filled with the smell that field hospitals always smell like, which is ether and blood and wet wool and cigarette smoke and the copper stink of men who have been opened up. And underneath all of it, the tallow reek of the lanterns burning. Those lanterns are worth pausing on. Remember them. You cannot operate in the dark. You cannot find a fragment in a chest cavity by feel. So the lanterns burned and the tents glowed, and from outside, in the black of a Belgian forest at night, a lit tent is a paper lamp. Every silhouette inside it is printed on the canvas for anyone standing in the dark to read. And across the tent roofs, they spread the red crosses. white panels, red cross stitched across them, laid out flat and lashed down so the wind would not take them, red cross flags on poles by the entrance. The vehicles in a row, alongside with the cross painted on the hood of each one. Here is what almost nobody understands about those markings, and it changes the entire meaning of what happened. The medics did not spread those crosses because they were afraid of German tanks. There were no German tanks. This was the rear. They spread them because of aircraft. Fighter bombers move at 300 miles an hour, and a pilot at that speed cannot tell a hospital from an ammunition dump. And men had been killed by their own air support before and would be again. The red cross on the roof was a message aimed straight up at the sky, and the audience it was written for was a 19-year-old American in the cockpit. It was never meant to be read at ground level from the Northeast by men in armored vehicles, but that is who read it. And 300 miles away, that same morning, in a cold stone barracks in Verdun, something else was happening that nobody at that crossroads knew anything about. Eisenhower had summoned his commanders. The Ardennes front had ruptured, and nobody in the room could yet say how badly, around a table with a map on it and a single stove that was not equal to the job. The senior officers of the American Army in Europe tried to work out how to stop a disaster that was still growing while they discussed it. Eisenhower asked how quickly the Third Army could disengage from its attack to the east, turn 90 degrees, and drive north. Lieutenant General George Patton said he could attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. There was laughter in the room, not cruelty, disbelief. What Patton had just proposed was to take an entire field army in contact with the enemy, break it off, wheel it a quarter turn in winter, and send it 100 miles in a new direction on iced roads. In 2 days, it was not a plan. It sounded like a boast. Patton was not boasting. He had seen this coming and had already had his staff draft the contingencies before he ever walked into that room. So on one single day, December 19th, 1944, 2 promises were made 300 miles apart. At a crossroads in the Bois de Herbemont, a group of exhausted men promised a stream of wounded boys that they would be taken care of, and spread a red cross over the roof to make the promise legible. In a cold room in Verdun, a general promised to come. Neither party knew the other existed. Neither promise was going to be kept the way it was made, and the 326th Airborne Medical Company had 11 and a half hours left. 10:30 at night. The tents were glowing. Surgery was going on in at least 2 of them. Men were on tables. Men were on litters on the ground waiting to be on tables. The generator was running somewhere, and the stoves were burning, and the whole installation made the low, steady industrial noise that a working hospital makes. And that noise is important because it is the reason nobody heard the engines until the engines were very close. They came out of the Northeast, armored vehicles, 6 of them, more or less, in the accounting. The Americans were able to reconstruct afterward half-tracks and tanks, with perhaps 100 infantry moving with them. They had come from the direction of Houffalize. They had been driving west for hours through country that was supposed to contain an American front and had instead contained almost nothing at all. Here is what the men in the tents did not know, and what almost none of them would learn for years, and some of them never. Those Germans had not come to kill a hospital. They had not been sent to find one. They did not know it was there. They were the leading element of an armored battle group racing west with an objective that had nothing to do with medicine or Bastogne or the 326th Airborne Medical Company. They were trying to reach a bridge over the Arthe at a place called Saal before the Americans could blow it. They were behind schedule and running in the dark on a road they did not know, and they came around a bend in the forest, and there was a crossroads, and at the crossroads was a cluster of lit canvas. Understand what happened in the next second, because everything hangs on it. The lead vehicle commander, whoever he was, saw glowing tents at a road junction inside what he understood to be hostile territory. He had a fraction of a second. Tents at a crossroads at night in a war zone are a headquarters, a signal station, a motor park, a barracks. He did what he had been trained to do, and what 100 other men in his position that winter also did. He opened fire, and for that first burst, for that first second and a half, you can construct an argument, a thin, cold, technical argument, but an argument, it is what happened next that cannot be argued. The machine guns opened up and the canvas did nothing. Canvas does not stop a rifle bullet, let alone a belt from a machine gun. And the rounds went through the tent walls, the way a finger goes through paper, and inside, the lanterns were still burning, and the surgery was still on the tables, and the men on the litters could not move, because that is the definition of being on a litter. The trucks caught fire, that is the moment, not the first burst. This one, those vehicles were parked in a row alongside the tents, and every one of them had a red cross painted on the hood, and when they went up, they burned the way vehicles burn, which is to say enormously, with a light that turns night into a kind of hideous orange noon for 100 yards in every direction. And in that light, everything became visible. The tent roofs, with the crosses spread across them and lashed down. The flags on the poles by the entrance, the unarmed men, the shapes of surgical tables, the whole thing lit up, unmistakable, legible from any distance. A machine gun can shoot. Captain Jacob Pearl survived that night, and he made a formal statement afterward, and there is one sentence in it that is the entire moral architecture of this story, compressed into 14 words. He said that the machine gun fire continued after the trucks were burning and after the nature of the installation was visible to the enemy. Read that again slowly. The fire continued after the nature of the installation was visible, not before. After they saw it, and they kept shooting 15 minutes. 15 minutes is not a burst. 15 minutes is not a mistake. A mistake lasts 2 seconds and ends in a shout and a raised hand. 15 minutes is 900 seconds. And in every one of those 900 seconds, a man behind a gun was looking at a red cross lit by burning trucks and choosing again, to keep his thumbs on the trigger inside the tents. There was nothing anyone could do. That is the part that lives in the survivors. There was no return fire because there were no weapons, because that was the entire point. That was the arrangement. That was the bargain the world had signed. You do not carry a gun and we do not shoot you. And the cross on your arm and your roof and your hood is the receipt. The medics did the only thing available. They put their bodies over the men on the litters. Think about that for a moment. In the middle of it, unarmed, in a burning field, men who had been operating 20 minutes earlier lay down on top of strangers who could not move and took what came through the canvas. There is a specific sound a bullet makes going through canvas that nobody who heard it that night ever described properly afterward. Because there is nothing to compare it to. It is not a bang. The bang is somewhere else, out in the dark, a long way off, arriving late and belonging to a different event entirely. What happens in the tent is smaller and worse. A shnap, atik, a neat little hole appearing in the wall with orange light behind it, and then another one, and then a row of them stitching across at chest height, and the lantern still burning on its hook, and the man on the table still open, and the surgeon's hands still inside him, because a surgeon cannot simply stop. The wind came through the holes. That is the thing they remember, not the noise. The draft Private First Class Henry G. Sullivan did not survive. He was the only man killed at that crossroads. One out of everything, Out of 15 minutes of sustained machine gun fire into a lit and marked hospital, 1 American died on the spot. And I want to be very careful here, because there is a way of telling this that treats that number as an anticlimax. And that way of telling it is a lie. Hold on to Henry Sullivan. We are coming back to him. And when we do, that number is going to mean something you cannot see yet. Then the guns stopped. Lieutenant Colonel David Gold walked out into the light of his own burning vehicles and surrendered his command. There is no medal for what Gold did. There is no citation, no ribbon, nothing in any file that says he was brave that night. He walked out of a tent into the open, unarmed, in front of men who had just spent a quarter of an hour proving what they were willing to shoot at. And he gave up an entire medical company because the alternative was to let them keep firing into the canvas. The Germans gave him 30 minutes to load his people and whatever equipment they could carry. And then everyone was going east. Picture the arithmetic of those 30 minutes. What do you take? Plasma, or instruments, the ether, or the sulfa, the man on the table who is halfway through an operation. Do you close him or do you carry him open? 30 minutes. In the dark. In the snow. With a burning truck for a lamp and a German officer's watch running. When it was done, they took 11 officers and 119 enlisted men of the 326th Airborne Medical Company. They took 3 officers and 2 enlisted men from the division surgeon's office. They took 4 officers and 3 enlisted men of a surgical team from the 3rd Auxiliary Surgical Group, specialists. The men you send for when the wound is past. What an ordinary surgeon can do. 18 officers, 125 enlisted men, and they marched them east, away from Bastogne, into a captivity that would last for the rest of the war. One man got out. Captain Jacob Pearl went into the dark during the confusion, and he did not stop. Somewhere behind him, the crossroads burned. Ahead of him were several miles of Ardennes forest at night in December. Deep snow, no light, no road he could safely use, and an unknown number of German vehicles between him and anywhere. He kept the burning behind him, and he walked toward Bastogne. And the temperature was doing what it does at that hour in that country, and he was carrying the single most important piece of intelligence in the sector inside his own head. The 101st Airborne Division no longer had a hospital. Not damaged, not degraded, gone, captured entire, with its surgeons, with its surgical teams, with its stores, marched off east in the snow, and the ring around Bastogne was closing behind him as he walked 300 miles south that same night. And the next day, an army was turning. What Patton had promised in that stone room at Verdun was now being executed by staff officers who had not laughed, because staff officers never get to laugh. The Third Army was in contact with the enemy and facing east. It had to stop, disengage, wheel, a quarter turn, and drive north. And it had to do this in the last week of December on Belgium and Luxembourg, roads under ice. The scale of it is difficult to hold in the mind. Not just men, fuel, ammunition, field hospitals, bridging equipment, signals. Every artillery piece had to be pulled out of a firing position, hitched, driven, and put back into a new firing position aimed at a different country. Traffic control officers stood at crossroads in the freezing dark for a day and a night and another day, waving columns through, because if 2 columns met head-on in a village at 3 a.m, the whole schedule died there in that village. And it worked. That is the thing. It should not have, and it did. On the morning of December 22nd, roughly 66 hours after Patton stood in that room and said it, the Third Army attacked north across a 20-mile front with 3 divisions, 66 hours. He had said 48, and he was over, and it did not matter. because what he had actually done was take the impossible and miss it by 18 hours. Leading it was the 4th Armored Division. Now hold both of these in your head at the same time, because this is the whole shape of what happened. On December 19th, at a crossroads in the woods, a hospital was destroyed and 143 medical personnel were marched into captivity. On December 19th, 300 miles away, a general promised to come. He did not know, that is what I need you to sit with. When George Patton made his promise, the 326th Airborne Medical Company was still alive, still working, still cutting fragments out of boys under lantern light. Their tents were still standing. Nobody at Verdun had ever heard of the Bois de Herbaillement, and nobody ever would. 2 promises. One day, 300 miles apart, and the distance between them was going to be measured in something other than miles. Inside Bastogne, the ring closed. By December 21st, the town was surrounded, cut off, no road in, no road out, no evacuation. And now the true cost of that crossroads began to come due, and it came due slowly over days on people who had not been anywhere near it. Because here is what nobody tells you about losing a clearing station. The men who were captured were not the victims. The captured were marched east, and it was miserable. And they were prisoners. And most of them would live. The victims were the men who had not been wounded yet. From December 19th to early January, the 101st Airborne Division took 341 killed, 516 missing, and 1,691 wounded, 1,691. Every one of those men was supposed to go to a division clearing station. That was the system. That was the promise the Army made when it handed a boy a rifle. If you are hit, there is a place, and at that place there are surgeons, and they will do everything that can be done for you. The place was gone. The surgeons were in Germany. Those 1,691 boys were wounded into a town that had almost no capacity to receive them. Now go back to Henry Sullivan. 1 man died at that crossroads. That is the number. I told you to hold on to it. Here is what that number actually means. The attack on the 326th was not lethal. It was disabling. It did not kill Americans that night. It removed the machinery that keeps Americans alive. 8 days before that machinery was needed, more than at any other moment in the division's history. The bill did not come due at the crossroads. It came due in a cellar, in a town, over the following week, on boys who, at the moment Sullivan died, were still fine, still walking around, still complaining about the cold, with no idea that something had just happened 4 miles to the west that had already decided how they were going to die. That is why the number is 1, not because it was small, because the killing had been postponed. What remained inside Bastogne was almost nothing. A handful of medical officers who had not been at the crossroads, and whatever enlisted men could be scraped together from the regiments. That was the surgical capability for a reinforced division, an armored combat command, a tank destroyer battalion, artillery, engineers, and stragglers from a collapsed front. By most reckonings, something on the order of 11,000 or 12,000 men in a hole with the Germans all around it. On December 21st, Major Martinel wisely opened a temporary clearing station in the town itself. It was not a hospital. It was a room with wounded men in it and a man in charge who was not going to pretend otherwise. There was another aid station in a cellar under a store on the Rue de Neufchâteau, where Captain Jack Pryor of the 20th Armored Infantry Battalion was doing what could be done, and what could be done was not much. Pryor was a battalion surgeon. Battalion surgeons stabilize. They are not equipped to do abdominal surgery or chest surgery, and now those cases were coming to him anyway, because there was nowhere else on earth for them to go Men with penetrating abdominal wounds were laid on the floor of a cellar and given morphine and a blanket. And everyone in that cellar knew exactly what that meant. It meant, this man is going to die over the next 2 days in front of us, and there is nothing here to prevent it. And the thing that would have prevented it is currently walking east through the snow under guard. Plasma froze in the cellar. They warmed it against their own bodies. And into that cellar, on December 21st, came 2 women. Renée Lemaire was a Belgian nurse from Bastogne. Augusta Chive-Vas, a Belgian nurse too, born in the Congo, home visiting her family for Christmas when the war closed on the town. Neither of them was in the army. Neither of them was American. Neither of them had to be there. There was no order, no obligation, no reason at all, except that there were wounded boys in the cellar and there were not enough hands. They came down the stairs and they went to work. Sit with the arithmetic of that. A field army had built a medical company, trained it, equipped it, moved it across an ocean, and lost it in 15 minutes. And the replacement, the thing that actually stood in the gap for a besieged American division at Christmas, was 2 civilian women in a basement. Chewie was a small woman, and she went out with the litter parties into the open Onafia to bring men in. Pryor wrote afterward about Lemaire that her presence among the wounded seemed to be an inspiration to men whose morale had gone down from prolonged suffering, which is the sort of language an army report permits. And underneath that language is a 19-year-old from Ohio holding the hand of a woman from Bastogne while he dies in a cellar because his surgeon is in a prisoner column. There was one thing Renée Lemaire wanted. There was a white silk parachute. She had asked for it, and she kept it because silk was not something you could buy in Belgium in 1944. And she intended one day, when this was over, to have a wedding dress made out of it. That is the detail I cannot get past. In a cellar full of dying men, in a surrounded town, in the coldest winter anyone could remember, a young woman was keeping a piece of silk because she still believed there was going to be an afterward. On December 22nd, the Germans sent a surrender demand into Bastogne. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe read it and gave the reply that became the most famous single word in the American Army. He said, nuts. It went out. The Germans could not understand it and had to have it explained, and it has been on coffee mugs ever since. And on that same December 22nd, 300 miles south, the 4th Armored Division crossed the line of departure and started north. The relief was coming. It had started, the men in the cellar did not know that Christmas Eve, the German Air Force came over Bastogne that night. Around 8:30, a bomb came down on the Rue de Neufchâteau, and it hit the building over the cellar where Pryor's aid station was, and the building came down on top of it. Renée Lemaire got 6 wounded men out of that burning building. 6. She went back in, and she brought them out, and then she went back one more time for a 7th, and the building took her. They found her afterward. Jack Pryor recovered her remains himself, and he wrapped her in the white silk parachute, the one she had been saving, the one she had asked for that very morning, the one that was going to be a wedding dress when this was all over. And he carried her out of the ruin of the Rue de Neufchâteau wrapped in it, and he took her to her parents. That is what the silk was for. That is what it turned out to be for all along. She was killed on Christmas Eve in the cellar. She had walked into voluntarily doing work that was only necessary because 5 days earlier and 4 miles away, some men had looked at a red cross lit by burning trucks and decided it was not a reason to stop shooting. That is the line. That is the whole thing. Pull it tight and you can feel it. The gun crews at Herbemont never saw Renée Lemaire. They never knew her name. They had no idea she existed. And they were 40 miles away and probably dead themselves by the time they killed her anyway. That is what a war crime is. not the 15 minutes, the 8 days afterward that the 15 minutes made inevitable, happening to people who were never in the field, whose names were never in the report, and who paid the bill in a basement while the men who ran it up were already somewhere else, running for a bridge in the dark on a road they did not know. 15 miles to the south, on Christmas Eve, the tanks of the 4th Armored Division were stopped in the snow and fighting and losing men and coming. They were 2 days away. She had needed them to be 2 days faster. December 26th, late afternoon, the light was already going. The 4th Armored Division had been fighting north for 4 days, and the last village in the way was a place called Ardennes. And there was nothing elegant about what happened there. American artillery came down on it in a concentration so tight that the tanks driving through were taking rounds from their own guns, falling short. They went through anyway. That was the decision. Drive into your own barrage, because stopping costs more. Out in front was Company C of the 37th Tank Battalion. And out in front of Company C was a single Sherman, an up-armored one, a thick-skinned model the crews called a jumbo. Somebody had painted a name on her, Cobra King. The man in the turret was Lieutenant Charles Bogus. He came up out of Ardennes with the snow going blue in the dusk and the tank making the noise. A tank makes, and ahead of him was open ground. And beyond the open ground was the southern edge of a perimeter that had been sealed for 8 days. And Bogus did not know what was in front of him. Nobody did. He fired into the tree line as he went, not because he had targets, but because there might be, and there was nothing to do about it, except keep moving. Then there were foxholes, American foxholes, at about 4:45 in the evening. Bogus got down off Cobra King in the snow, and a man came up out of a hole in the ground, and he was an American engineer, and he was grinning. Second Lieutenant Webster, Company A, 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion. Look at that number again, 326th, a different unit entirely, the engineers, not the medics, but the same 3 digits, and the coincidence is worth a second of your time. Because on the 19th of December, the 326th was marched east into captivity in the snow, and on the 26th of December, the 326th stood up out of a foxhole and shook the hand of the man who ended the siege. Same number, same division. One of them had lost everything and the other one had held on. And the road between those two moments ran for 8 days through a cellar on the Rue de Neufchâteau. The corridor Bogus opened was about 100 yards wide. That was all. 100 yards of contested ground with Germans on both sides of it who had not surrendered and did not intend to. It was enough because on the 27th, the ambulances ran. That is the sentence. After 8 days, wheels turned south out of Bastogne, carrying men who should have been carried out on the 20th and the 19th, and every single day in between. The evacuation reopened the thing that had been severed at a crossroads in the Bois d'Ardennes on the night of December 19th was finally spliced back together. Somewhere in that town was Captain Jacob Pearl. He had walked out of a burning hospital 8 days earlier, carrying the worst news in the sector inside his own head. And he had gotten to Bastogne and told them. And then he had done the only thing there was left to do, which was stay and work with what remained. He had watched what he predicted come true. He had watched men die of the absence of the surgeons he used to work beside. He had been in the town on Christmas Eve when the bomb came down on the Rue de Neufchâteau, and on December 27th he watched the ambulances leave. Nobody wrote down what he thought about that. He does not have a quote. History does not preserve the interior life of a captain in a medical company. And I am not going to invent one for him, because inventing one would be the same crime this entire story is about, which is deciding that the truth of what happened to these men is not quite good enough as it stands. He walked 8 days for that. That is the fact. Make of it what you will, and know that it is real, which is more than can be said for for most of what gets said about this war. On December 28th, Major William E. Barfield turned command of the 326th Airborne Medical Company over to Captain Roy H. Moore, Jr., and the work of rebuilding a unit out of replacements began, because that is what the Army does. It does not mourn, it reconstitutes. Somewhere east of the Rhine, 18 officers and 125 enlisted men were in a prisoner column. And back in Belgium, a captain was signing for new tent poles. On December 30th, George Patton came to Bastogne. He went to the chateau where the 101st had its command post, and outside it there were still the burned-out shapes of German tanks that had been knocked out on Christmas Day. And Patton looked at him because he was Patton, and then he did the only thing in this entire story that could be called his response. He pinned the Distinguished Service Cross on Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. He pinned one on Lieutenant Colonel Steve Chapuis. There is a photograph. You can find it. Patton in his coat. McAuliffe beside him. The two of them talking in a Belgian courtyard on the 30th of December, 1944. That is it. That is the response. And now I have to tell you the truth. And the truth is going to be harder than the story you came here for. There is no evidence that George Patton ever knew about the 326th Airborne Medical Company. There is no memorandum. There is no war crimes filing dated December 20th. There is no order to hunt down the man who did it. There is no scene where a general reads a report and sets it down and says something terrible and quiet to an aide who writes it in a notebook. I looked. It is not there. And if I put it in front of you and told you it happened, I would be doing to Henry Sullivan exactly what has been done to him for 80 years, which is to use him as a prop in somebody's better story. When Patton stood up at Verdun on December 19th and promised to attack in 48 hours, the hospital was still standing. The men in it were alive. They were working. It had not happened yet. He did not promise because of them. He never knew. And that right there is the thing that will not leave you alone once you see it. Because if Patton had known, then this would be a revenge story. And revenge stories are comfortable. Somebody does something monstrous. A hard man finds out. The hard man answers. You can sleep after a story like that. It has a shape. This does not have that shape. What actually happened is that at a crossroads in Belgium, a hospital was shot to pieces while its markings were plainly visible, and one boy died, and the surgeons were marched off into the snow, and 1,691 men were wounded over the next 2 weeks into a town that had almost nothing left to treat them with. And a nurse who wanted a wedding dress died in a cellar on Christmas Eve, and the relief column arrived on the 26th for reasons that had nothing at all to do with any of it. Patton came because Eisenhower asked him to at a meeting about a strategic penetration. He was not late because he did not care. He was not slow because he did not know. He drove that army harder than any American general had ever driven. 66 hours from a standing start in a winter that was freezing men to death in their holes. And it was the fastest thing anybody did in that entire war. And it was still 8 days. That is what unforgiving actually means. And it has nothing to do with what Patton did to the Germans. It means the world does not adjust. It does not speed up because a 19-year-old is bleeding in a cellar. The distance from Verdun to Bastogne stayed exactly as long as it had always been. The snow did not thin. The Germans in Airdennes did not stand aside. Every hour Patton bought. He bought by spending men in villages nobody has heard of. And he still could not buy enough of them because the arithmetic was fixed before he ever started. And it was fixed by 6 armored vehicles that were looking for a bridge and found a hospital instead. René Lemaire needed him to be 2 days faster. He was already going faster than it was possible to go. The prisoners came home when the war ended. The company was rebuilt and went back to work. and it finished the war. And the men who had been marched east that night got on ships and went back to towns in America and grew old and mostly did not talk about it. Private First Class Henry G. Sullivan did not come home. He was the only man killed at the crossroads, and he was a medic. And medics do not carry weapons. That was not an oversight. That was the deal. He stood in a field with a red cross on the truck beside him, and a red cross on the roof over his head, and a red cross on the band around his arm. And every one of those crosses was a sentence in a contract that the entire civilized world had signed. And the sentence said, "This man cannot hurt you. Therefore you will not hurt him." He kept his half of it. He was unarmed when he died. He never had a weapon to put down. They broke theirs. And here is the last thing, the thing I want you to take with you. Henry Sullivan was right. That is what nobody says about him. Not naive, not a fool who trusted a piece of cloth. Right. The rule he trusted was the correct rule. It is still the rule. It was the rule that night. And the men behind those guns knew it, and the fact that they broke it does not make him wrong. It makes them criminals. A rule is not proved false when a criminal breaks it. It is proved necessary. He died at a crossroads in a Belgian forest on the 19th of December, 1944. And 8 days later, at the far end of a road that had cost the Third Army every hour, it had a lieutenant named Bogus climbed down off a tank called Cobra King and shook hands with an engineer, and the ambulances ran, and nobody in that corridor knew Henry Sullivan's name. They were the answer anyway, not revenge. Nobody was punished. Nobody paid. The answer was that the ambulances ran. It was 8 days late, and it cost more than anyone will ever be able to add up, and it is the only answer this story has. It had to be enough